Welcome back to another episode of our podcast. Today we are joined, like normal, with the partners in our broker firm. We have Dr. Lee Maddox, we have Michael Maddox, and myself, Jason Wood. And today we're going to be talking about buying a dental practice. Some of the things to be thinking about when buying a practice, maybe some things that you're not necessarily thinking about, both clinical and non-clinical, that might be important for your acquisition. So we'll go, Lee, tell us some things that maybe buyers don't know are going to be important or things that they should be thinking about when looking at acquiring a practice.
Loaded question.
I know.
So when I'm working on the broker side of things, I only represent the seller.
Mm-hmm.
So we assist the buyer by providing them information, but we don't represent the buyer. So there's a whole conversation we can have about what that buyer representation or lack of representation looks like, and Michael can kind of let us know how we work through that separation between giving them information but not representing them. And then when I'm on the lawyer side representing the buyer, it's a whole nother issue. So I'm going to start with the lawyer side. So if I'm representing the buyer at the lawyer side, I am more often than not representing them after they've signed a letter of intent. It's preferred that if they that I get involved with the letter of intent phase of it, but many buyers feel pressure to sign the offer letter quickly and maybe think that it's expensive or time. It's going to be a real time drag to slow the process down to get a letter of intent signed. And while letters of intents come in different styles, there can be a binding letter of intent or a non-binding letter of intent. And by the way, letter of intent, offer letter, all these things, they're the same thing. So even if it's a non-binding letter of intent, once the terms are in the letter of intent, people get emotionally connected to it. And when you start trying to change it, it can throw a deal off. So a letter of intent is the starting point of the transaction, and it should be a buyer's document. Like the buyer should draft the letter of intent, present it to the seller, and the seller reacts from the letter of intent. But a lot of times in our industry, the initial document is being prepared by the broker or maybe even seller's counsel.
Right.
So the document that's coming out is not reflective of the buyer's offer. It might be a neutral document or it might be a seller-cited document. So the first thing buyers need to understand is that should be their document. They should own it. So what we do in our brokerage firm is we provide a sample letter of intent or offer letter to the buyer, and we say, these have the very basic terms that we need to get started: your name, seller's name, address, the amount you want to ask for, some basic legal terms. Take it to your attorneys, have them mark it up, and then once you have a document you're willing to sign it and send it to us. Now that seems a little backwards, but we take that signed letter of intent and then we present it to the seller. The seller's never seen it. Now the seller is going to have to stop and have their attorney look at it, and there might be some revision back on it. But it should be buyer's offer to seller, and then seller reacting to buyer's offer. So in contrast, what I see a lot of times is the offer is written by the broker and they claim that it's a neutral document. It's a neutral document with the price term. It's a neutral document with the closing date. In some of these neutral documents, they're discussing allocations, which
Right.
requires a CPA's input. They're talking about buying back accounts receivables at preset, discounted rates. They're talking about excluding some things. They're talking about seller working back in compensation models, whether they're hired as an independent contractor or employees. These are all big legal issues that need to be hammered out. And if the seller presents that in a way that's best for the seller, the buyer may find themselves in somewhat of a disadvantaged position. So not to get too long, because there's so many things we can talk about. So just that starting position or that offer letter, I would say that 80% of the time in the legal process that I get involved, the letter of intent's already been signed. The next thing that happens is I might be engaged, but I don't really start working until after the doctor has loan approval. So the letter of intent was signed 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks have gone by, and then I get a purchase and sale agreement that has terms in there that are adverse to the buyer, and the buyer's not happy with them. So before I move on, why don't you talk about your ideas of these letter of intent?
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting you say that. So I make it a point in my law firm. I believe that the vast majority of mistakes are made at the LOI stage. And I believe in it so strongly that we, as a law firm, we say, bring us in. If we don't get past the letter of intent, we'll either refund you your money or we'll pick it up and move it to the next deal that you're looking at, because we don't want a legal fee to be an impediment to having representation, because so many mistakes are made. And you're right, they're legally non-binding. And so when brokers say that, they're not lying, but they are lying, because while legally non-binding, and you said it earlier, it's psychologically binding. You try to convince us or tell a seller, hey, I want a $75,000 purchase price reduction because X, Y, and Z. If they are not material modifications, major discrepancies in what, the document showed in terms of the financials and what we received, it's going to probably cause the deal to fall apart, or you're going to lose goodwill, or you're going to do something like that. And so having representation prior to the LOI being signed, in my opinion, not only is extremely important, but it also helps the deal to kind of deal with a lot of the creases and iron those creases out before you even get to the purchase agreement.
Well, I agree. And I prefer to get the letter of intent before it's signed.
Absolutely.
But what I was trying to stress was that we're getting a letter of intent signed, and then I'm seeing the letter of intent and the purchase and sale agreement 3 or 4 weeks later. Yeah. The contingencies are all blown.
Right. It's a huge issue.
Yeah. And then if the doctor hasn't had time to discuss the allocations with their buyer, hasn't had a chance to discuss the allocations with their CPA, because they haven't even received financials, and the buyer and the CPA hasn't received financials, and it's already locked into the LOI. It's not fair. It's not right. So
yeah, I spend a ton of time talking with people before we even do an offer. So I say, send me all the documents you have. Let me take a look at the prospectus. Let me look at the tax returns. Let me analyze this practice. And then what I do is I get on the phone with them, and I mean, it doesn't take very long. We analyze the prospectus, we look at the add backs, we look at the procedures, and then I start talking to the potential buyer. And the questions that I ask are, how much do you, as an associate, how much do you produce on a monthly basis? Do you do all the procedures the seller does? Would you add any procedures? If it's a GP practice, what is the percentage of hygiene? And what a lot of people forget to do is figuring out what true hygiene is. Are the doctor exams included, or are they not? So you have to analyze that a little bit as well. But we get through all of these to determine, if I put this buyer into this practice, what does it look like? Using the strengths and weaknesses of the buyer in relation to the practice at hand, what does it look like? And so that opens up the door to further questions of, okay, well, this doctor is producing $900,000 as an associate. Why are you trying to buy a practice that is generating $500,000? When you factor in hygiene, it's generating $350,000 in doctor production. Like, help me understand why you want this practice. Why is this the practice for you? And that opens up, discussions about economics and, how what's the word I'm looking for? Lost opportunity costs are, and all these other issues, to determine, is this really a practice that you should be acquiring? Because I don't want clients to spend money on me, a CPA, and then they come to find out that although I'm qualified for a bank loan, this doesn't make sense for me as it relates to what I can do, what I'm doing in my associateship. And so what we're trying to do, or at least what I try to do, is maximize who the buyer is for that particular practice. And I mean, that I love doing. Now, if someone really wants that practice, I need you to sell me on why this $500,000 practice makes sense for you, a $900,000 producer who really should be looking at practices doing 1.1, 1.2 million. So, but Michael, for you, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of buyers. Is there this concern about additional debt when they're coming, to the brokerage firm and they're looking at practices? Do you get a sense that a lot of younger buyers are looking at smaller practices because they're afraid of debt, or do they have an understanding of cash flow?
To answer your question, yes and no. Some of these guys are with a lot of debt. They want a practice that's doing more because they want to pay off their debt faster, I think. And then there's other ones who are looking for that smaller practice because they are worried about debt, but then they're worried about having to keep another job, an associate job, and
Right.
and trying to find the balance of how they're going to be successful in practice ownership.
Right. Do you get is there a sense of, I don't know, almost like regionality in terms of, are you seeing like a dichotomy between metropolitan areas and rural areas in terms of what buyers are looking for, opportunities? I don't know. Maybe you can go into that a little bit.
We haven't done too much rural areas yet, but we do have a practice in somewhat of a rural area, and we're having trouble attracting buyers to that area just because it seems like everyone wants to be in a shopping center, somewhere with a lot of foot traffic, and they, it's kind of what they're hearing on podcasts or in seminars of what they should be doing, and that they need a huge sign and this and that. In reality, the practices that they're looking at have been successful for 20, 30 years and can continue to be successful as long as they keep operating it as it has been operating. Then, like you said, they can add procedures and, technology as the years go by. So, yeah, I mean, I can't speak too much to the rural areas, but I think out there it's somebody maybe moving into the state, just looking to get a foothold, and then 5-6 years moving on to another spot maybe.
Yeah, I always tell clients, or when I'm doing podcasts or when I'm doing presentations, go where others won't go, and you'll always be successful. And the amount of people that have actually listened to me are probably, I don't know, 2, 3, 4%. Right. I'm like, no, go to Overlook, Kansas. I promise you, you'll be insanely successful. You really don't need pizza at 3 a.m. Don't worry about it. There's a Costco. You can wake up. It's totally fine. But this allure of metropolitan areas. But do buyers understand that there's more competition, that it's harder? Do they get that?
Well, that's the other thing. They're always worried about, there's another dentist next door. There's 5 dentists in the building.
Right.
So you do see that, but they still want to be there.
Yeah, so I just finished lecturing at a university to some residents and having a similar conversation. So if we back up way back in this conversation, pre-letter of intent, buyers have to make a decision about where they want to live. And I was explaining to them that when I picked the practice that I ultimately acquired, I identified the location, and then I would test drive from different areas and see how far I was willing to drive in the morning and how far I was willing to drive in the afternoon with traffic, because I knew I was going to own that practice. Well, I thought I was going to own that practice for the rest of my life, and I wanted to have an understanding of the drive and the traffic and the stress I was going to take, missing kids' activities if I couldn't get there, or getting home late at night, or did I have to come in early? So the point of this is you have to figure out where you want to live. And so if we're going to back up to the basic buyer questions, the questions are, where do you want to live? And, I just got off the phone with somebody right now who is living in a place where she's actually moved there 5 years ago, and she's now moving back to a more metropolitan place. And she said it was the worst 5 years of my life.
Interesting.
Because she was a fish out of water. She wasn't from the area, didn't get to know very many people, didn't understand the culture of the people that lived there. And she's much more comfortable moving back to where she's at. So that's a decision that should be made on an associate level, go testing those areas. But if you're going to buy, you shouldn't be testing. You should know. So you have to identify the areas you want to be. And as you mentioned earlier, and Michael's mentioned earlier, the younger people really want to be in the metropolitan areas. There's more going on. There's theater, there's art, there's concerts, there's lots of activities. And not that that doesn't happen in a smaller community. It's just, as you know, you live in a smaller community. There's not as much of that going on. So yeah, basically they needed to figure out where they want to live. That's a kind of a primary question. The second question is, what kind of a building do you want to be in? And Michael mentioned it already, shopping center. Do you want to be in a shopping center, Class A, Class B building? Do you want to be in a single tenant building? Are you looking to own the building later, which would require that you buy into a condo complex or a single tenant building? So they really need to identify the location, and the location could be tied to the payer mix, right? So if they're looking to run a super high volume practice with lots of operatories, then they're going to need to have a lot of new patients, and they might want to be in a shopping center because there might be a perception there's going to be more walk-up traffic or new patients walking in the door than being in the 10th floor of a medical dental building. And in some areas, granted, you have no choice. You have to be in the medical dental building, or maybe some areas where there are no medical dental buildings and you're all in shopping centers. So first off, geographically, where do you want to be? Why do you want to be there? And you're a married guy, and Michael's has 2 kids now, so he's come to the reality that what you want all your life may change when you hook up with a significant other, and all of a sudden you're worried about schools and other things, right? So making this decision of where you want to live as a single person versus making the decision when you're a married person are dramatically different, and it depends if you're in a specialty too. So I was talking to an endodontic group today, and I was saying I really didn't want to practice where I lived. And that's because endodontics, you deal with a lot of pain. Either people are presenting your pain or they have a percentage chance of having pain post-op. And I really didn't want to go to the supermarket and run into somebody holding their face saying, "Thanks, doc, I really feel great." I just thought it would be better not to live in the same community, which is why I chose my location, and I would drive, and my distance was 20 to 30 minutes, no traffic, hour with traffic. Anything after that, I couldn't live, or I couldn't go with this location. And I knew I wanted to be coastal. So, I bought a practice in Orange. I tested the drive from Long Beach, from Huntington Beach, from Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, San Clemente. I really wanted to find out if I could have that practice in that location. And then the other thing I was looking at is demographics, right? Who are the people I'm going to be working on? Blue collar, white collar, what are they going to be? What's the mean income? Are these kind of people I want to have as friends, or people I want to work on? So when you're looking at going into the area, and I'm not going to mention cities, but one of my early jobs, I worked in an area and people were really not nice, and treated me, like I took out their trash or something. And I moved into a much nicer community where people were kinder. And that's a much more rewarding experience if you can pick the community where you understand who the people are and you can get along with them well. So finding the right place to go, this is all practice management stuff. It's
Right.
not the law stuff that we do, but geography, distance to drive, payer mix, all these kinds of, and then the building type, of course. I'm not counseling people on where to go. I tend to get involved after the fact. But on the broker side, we're asking these questions.
Right.
People are calling us up and saying, "Hey, do you have a practice for sale in this area?" And the answer is, "Why do you want to be here? What brings you back?" "Oh, my mom and dad live in town," or "I went to school here," or "I've always wanted to live in San Diego. I'm living back in Maine and it's super cold a lot." And okay, well, great. Where do you want to live in San Diego? "Well, I want to live inland San Diego." "Oh, why?" "If you came from a cold place, you'd want to be on the beach every day." "Oh, well, my grandma lives here." So, we're trying to figure out why they want to be here because we don't want to waste our sellers' time. And so those questions come up on the broker side, not so much on the law side for me.
Well, and in our practices out of California, I mean, it's interesting when we're dealing with our national clients in terms of oftentimes we're dealing with bigger practices than a lot of metropolitan areas. So you take New York, Chicago, you take parts of Florida, the metropolitan areas of Texas, Seattle. It seems like the practices struggle a little bit more to get to that $1 to $2 million than a lot of our practices in I call them like second tier metropolitan areas, where we seem to have more bigger practices. And I always think that it's lack of saturation. But then sometimes when I'm looking at the numbers, the saturation, while different, isn't as different as I thought. Like, yeah, Irvine, California is probably the worst place in the world to get a practice, 571-to-1 ratio, but everybody wants to buy there. Everyone wants to be there, and people are still successful. And so, I guess, okay, so we've done the LOI. We've now moved to the due diligence phase.
Well, let's spend a little more time on the LOI.
Okay.
So why don't you go into your preference on binding versus non-binding LOI and how that impacts the buyer?
Well, I think LOI should be non-binding, except for, certain things like exclusivity, where that has to be binding. Otherwise, anybody can just do whatever they want. So there's definitely some provisions within an LOI that I want to be binding, but the vast majority are non-binding for a reason. Now, in most states, it is presumed that a letter of intent will be non-binding. Now, there are some states that you have to be careful of that. And so it's usually a good idea, regardless of what state you're in, to state that it's non-binding, even though, like California, it's presumed.
Why is it good non-binding for the buyer, and why is it good non-binding for the seller?
Well, you haven't done your homework. If on the buyer side, you haven't done your homework. You've got due diligence. You've seen some of what the practice is, but you haven't delved into it. You haven't looked at the warts. You haven't looked at all of the issues surrounding, like you said, procedures, payor mix, lease rental rates, just everything surrounding the practice. All you've seen is the first level when you're putting in that offer. But
they still have that opportunity with a binding LOI.
They do, but as it relates, well, I've seen litigation on LOIs when we've pushed for a modification to LOI after discovering additional due diligence items. So I would say that it depends on which state.
Well, how does that differ? They can still withdraw with a binding LOI if they're before the contingencies expire, and they can withdraw on a non-binding.
Right. We've actually had sellers.
You're talking after the contingency expires.
I'm talking about sellers' counsels trying to force a deal to close. Mm-hmm. Even though contingencies survived, even though there were material, I won't say misrepresentations, but material differentials between what we were first shown and what we weren't. And so for me, it's always safer to have a non-binding LOI because you can always get out. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be threats of litigation. There's not going to be threats of violations or anything else. So for me, it's just safer. I tend to be aggressive. When I represent clients on the legal side, I tend to be relatively aggressive. At least that's my reputation. But as it relates to binding versus non-binding on an LOI, I'm I guess pretty conservative because I want it to be non-binding. So,
yeah, and for years when I ran the Henry Schein team, I made them all binding. And my rationale for that was I felt that there was a group of people that like to run around and put offer on $1 million practices and go to the party and brag about how many offices they had tied up. And on the broker side, I didn't want my clients getting emotionally invested and wasting 30 or 60 days with somebody who wasn't serious, which is why when I ran Henry Schein, we brought in, deposits when not very many people were doing deposits. And I made all my LOIs binding, but there's pros and cons on both sides. And that's why I just want to go through those issues. I mean, if the seller has a binding LOI, I think the seller feels more confident that the transaction is going to get done. But then if the seller falls out of love with the buyer, it's harder for the seller to get out because there aren't typically escape clauses in an LOI for a seller to get out. There's contingencies in the LOI, and we can talk about what's in an LOI. There's contingencies in LOIs for due diligence, review of the financials, review of the equipment, office lease, loan, those types of things. And those are all contingencies for the buyer. But very seldom do you see a clause in there that says, I suddenly hate the buyer, I can get out, right? There's none of those kind of clauses.
Well, if I recall,
I don't like their lawyer. Yes, don't talk. yeah, don't say that. I don't want to go on the record on that. But so what happens is if you have a binding LOI, it can benefit the seller, and then it can also inhibit the sellers to get out of the transaction without maybe getting forced into having to perform and sell. And let's talk about why would a seller want to get out? I mean, a seller might want to get out because more money, right? That's the first thing.
Right.
Maybe a better offer comes, and instead of accepting a backup offer, they can take a position that, hey, it's non-binding. Sorry, tell your person to leave, and now take the buyer in behind. So from the buyer perspective, then the buyer may have spent money with counsel.
Mm-hmm.
The buyer may have spent money with or spent time and maybe some loan origination fees with the lender. The buyer may have spent time doing due diligence with the equipment rep and with their CPA. Maybe have invested $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 of money and a significant amount of time. And 5 minutes before the deal closes, the seller can say it's non-binding. So and so from the flexibility to get out phase, which I understand you like, to hey, I just wasted my time. We have to kind of bridge that and figure out what's the best way to manage it. And then from the seller having the comfort of thinking it's going to go through once we get to the contingency dates, or before, and then versus hey, it's non-binding. I don't know if this is going to happen. To the point where hey, I'm in the deal and I really don't like this person. I want to get out of this transaction. So there's both sides to it. I get it.
Absolutely. I think that there's a balancing act, I would say, because, for instance, you mentioned the buyers that like to brag about tying practices up. Well, guess what? That only happens for a certain period of time. And then if your reputation precedes you, you're going to have people not accepting your offers no matter how good they are.
Right.
And so, it sucks to be one of those first people that – now I got to wait 30, 45 days and this guy's walking around and now he's going to come in or she's going to come in and she's going to try to lowball me at the end. And, I think that when it's non-binding and that starts to happen, as a seller, you have the right to pull out, pretty quickly too. And if you've got that backup offer, that's an additional threat. Like, hey, you're going to do this? I'm out. So it's interesting.
I would say that our current company does non-binding, just FYI, and the reason is it's less confrontational when I have to deal with an attorney like you or somebody on that side who wants it to be non-binding. Number one, and then number two, it leaves more flex. And I didn't mean that derogatorily.
Of course not.
And number two, it gives my seller the flexibility to bail out of the deal, but also my seller then has to, as Michael said, we have to set expectations and be careful that we communicate that the deal's not the deal until the paper's signed. But it's a good question, binding versus non-binding. And then we can now dovetail into security deposits and refundability of security deposits on binding versus non-binding. And, my personal view on this is I never want my sellers to keep a security deposit. And some of my sellers don't understand where I'm coming from. And we live in a digital age. And if I think you keep a security deposit for $5,000 and somebody yelps you, how much would you spend to get rid of the indelible mark, out there? So for $5,000, I'd rather not have somebody out there bad mouthing me. And I think karma, but I've only can think of one time where the security deposit was kept by my client, and we warned the buyer like 3 times. Like the buyer kept asking for extensions, and we finally said, "Look, we're going to do it this last time, but if you go past this date, we're going hard on your money. You're not getting back." And the buyer just, did nothing in good faith to get the deal done and asked for another extension. And we were just, "No, you're out and we're keeping your deposit." So I don't know about that, but I don't like keeping the money. I don't know what's your view on the security deposit thing.
For me, security deposit is to basically put up or shut up for me.
Right.
And it's this additional layer of, do we have a legitimate buyer? Second realm of that is, has this buyer secured advisors? If I'm putting up a security deposit, if I am paying for advisors, I'm a serious buyer. Now, there may be things that I find out that cause me to pull out of the deal, but if I'm representing a seller, that gives me a lot more faith that the deal is going to go forward. If someone is spending money on due diligence, if someone is basically putting their money where their mouth is. However, I'm dealing with a broker in Tennessee right now, and their position is $25,000.
Yeah, that's the next issue. How much?
Non-refundable, to put an offer in.
Yeah.
And we revised it to what's normal. Normal's roughly $5,000. Some people put 1% of the purchase price and things like that. But, 5, maybe $10,000, depending upon certain variables. But it's an endo practice, and they're wanting $25,000 non-refundable. And we're like, you're insane.
Crazy, yeah.
And so we tried to revise it, and they came back wanting it. And we were like, look, we will never sign an LOI with a $25,000 non-refundable. We try to revise it. We try to say, hey, we'll do our due diligence, 45 days, fine. Then it'll be non-refundable. But it's not $25,000. It's lower. And then when we get loan approval, as long as we have enough money in the bank to still qualify, we'll up it to $25,000. Like, so we're really trying to work with this seller/broker, and they just came back saying no. And it was like, well, good luck finding a buyer, because where this was at wasn't the strongest market. And
this is a nationwide broker or local
this
broker?
This is a broker that
specializes.
It's a broker that likes to pull from equipment reps from the big company.
Oh, I wouldn't have any clue who that could be.
Yeah, none whatsoever. So, anyways.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that's interesting. We setting expectations from, this is a buyer conversation, but from a seller's conversation.
Right.
We only represent sellers, and we want to protect the seller as much as we can. And I agree with what you said. We want a security deposit because we want people that are serious.
Mm-hmm.
And we feel like somebody who puts a security deposit in is serious and is going to proceed. I agree with the next thing. If they're hiring their advisors, that's also a very positive thing. So let's say you're in a transaction, you're representing the seller, and the buyer has put in a good faith deposit, 5,000, 1%, whatever it is. And we hit the contingency dates, and now the buyer wants to back out in a non-binding LOI. So what is your position if the seller wants to proceed legal on that? Your position is, too bad, it's non-binding. We'll keep the deposit. And then what if it's a binding LOI? Are you encouraging your sellers to try to force the buyer to buy the practice?
For me, I'm typically very similar to you. Like, we're tripping over pennies here, because one of the worst things that could happen is now all of a sudden we're fighting over security deposit. And if I'm representing the seller, I have to disclose that to the next potential buyer. Because if we're actually involved in litigation, or we're involved in threats of litigation, we have to disclose that. Right. And so what is the harm to the potential deal? And for me, it's just, look, this sucked. We all wasted time here, and let's just move forward as quickly as we can. $5,000 in the grand scheme of things, not great, but that's why I like the deposit potentially going non-refundable after a certain period of time. Mm-hmm. And I like what you said. Hey, we'll give you, and this is not in every instance, but we'll give you one extension, which, by the way, the buyer needs to request. If the buyer doesn't request it, well, then it's already non-refundable. So I think it tends to keep parties focused and committed to the deal if there's timelines in place.
I think you bring a good point up, and we're coming back to where I was before.
Yeah.
If the LOI is signed and we haven't seen it, and we don't get to see it until the purchase and sale agreement is prepared after the loan happens,
right?
A lot of times the contingency is already gone and the money's non-refundable, and I think I see that as a big problem. And so I think the message for the buyers are, you got to keep track of your own contingencies. Even if I'm involved, I'm not tracking your contingency expiration dates. If you sign an LOI, whether I'm involved in the beginning or involved later, you need to put it on your calendar and make sure you follow your contingencies. We try very hard here to track the contingencies and extend it out, but it's not our job as a broker to make sure the buyer doesn't miss their contingencies. We try not to have that happen, but we also work for the seller. So that almost sounds like a conflict, because the seller would like the contingencies to go by and the deal to go hard, but we'd also want to make sure that we have a serious buyer and not keep wasting time. So we will go back like, hey, there's 2 days left in the contingency. are you in or you out? Because we
Right.
don't want to waste any more time. But there are some times where we miss it, and there are times, and we have one right now where a buyer never engaged their legal counsel, signed the LOI, and is at least a month past all the contingency dates. And I'm absolutely certain that my seller is going to want to keep the deposit if they back out of the deal. But it's not our job as a broker. So just if you learn something from the podcast here is that if you're a buyer and you have letter of intents, it's like a bill date. You need to pay attention to it and pay on time. Or here you need to make sure you pay attention to your contingency dates and extend them or back out before you blow the contingency.
Actually, it's one of the things I love about our brokerage is just how much data you have on each and every transaction. I mean, Michael, what you were showing me the other day, I mean, it's just impressive. You guys have everything in a transaction. So I haven't seen that from other, I mean, again, I work with dozens of brokers all over the United States, and the amount of information that you're compiling, even though you don't represent the buyer, right, you're like pulling the buyer on. So
right. Yeah, and the seller wants to know too. So
right,
even if they don't go through, I could tell them how many buyers have looked at it, how many NDAs, what days, times, etc. So yeah, just keeping all the information. I think it's important.
Okay. So let's back up again.
Oh my goodness, we're never going to get past an LOI.
We may not. So how did the buyer make the decision to even sign the LOI? So I think you raised the issue that your law firm, in contrast to many law firms, perhaps, are going to look at the financials. But when I'm working on the law side, I think it's not my job to look at the financials. So I get the letter of intent. It's
not. You're right.
And also I don't want to pick up the liability on it, but that's a different issue. But if the buyer is if it's a situation where they're dual represented, I think the buyer should know there is no real such dual representation in a buyer-seller broker transaction.
No.
And it's not to their advantage. The seller's broker gets paid when the commission gets paid when the deal gets done, so they're motivated to get the deal done. There's no neutrality there, conflict. But if the seller's represented by a broker and the buyer's presented financial information, how do they determine they want to make an offer, right? So, Michael, what are you seeing that buyers are doing to figure out if they want to make an offer now? What are the questions they're asking us?
Well, they look at the financials. We always recommend, talk to us, your team, whether that be your lender, your attorney, and come to the table with an offer, and we'll deliver it to the seller and get back to you if it's appropriate or not. If it's not a full price offer,
But do you find that they go to their CPA in the offer stage or after the offer stage?
In the offer stage, a lot of times I think they're going to a lender if they're already talking to a lender and they're pre-qualified to see if they could get a loan for a certain amount or what they could get a loan for.
And what are the issues that the lenders are triggering them to be concerned about that when they're in that decision making of whether they sign the LOI?
Well, how much debt they have, how much the asking price is, Delta Premier. They're asking about Delta Premier and wanting to get an adjustment right off the bat. So
what's the issue with Delta Premier?
In states like California.
It's Delta Premier, the new buyers can't come in and assume Premier status. So they're going to have to do Delta PPO, which is 20 to 30% lower on the fees. Could be. So,
yeah. And that's just so listeners, that's spreading. I mean, most states do not allow a buyer to assume the Premier only fees. There are still a few states that allow it, but it is very small in comparison. So what Michael is saying is that when you, the buyer, have a Premier only practice, you, the buyer, are not going to be able to only have Premier fees. And the dirty little secret is 99.9% of those patients aren't Premier patients. They're PPO patients. So you'll get a reduction in your reimbursement rate. In California, around 20 to 30, sometimes even more. In other states, it's not as bad, but it's still something you have to be painfully aware of.
Yeah, so. And I kind of raised the issue because Michael talks to the buyers way more than I do.
Right.
I'm behind my wall of computers, typing away all day, and Michael's on the phone with buyers all day. and there will be buyers that will make an offer like right away. Like this is the, like you said, this is the practice that came up in the area. I've been waiting for it.
Mm-hmm.
The price is all I'm looking at. I'm good. I'm going to sign it. I'll let my attorney look at it later. Okay. But Michael will take 10, 15, 20 calls from some people just asking a ton of questions up front to make a decision on whether or not they want to make an LOI. And a lot of that will do with payer mix and trying to figure out the Delta issue, the HMO issue, the Medi-Cal issue. We have a mixed practice with pedo and GP. How many pedo patients do we have? How many GP patients do we have? So, I mean, there's a lot of times that the buyers will spend a lot of time up front before they get to a letter of intent, which is, I think it can be good because the deal moves faster after the fact, but it's also not the norm, right? So a lot of people are making these offers very quickly, and there is no true buyer representation. There are a couple of people out there now doing buyer representation, and they're getting some help on it, but there's no buyer representation. And so
Don't get me started on
if you're
buyer reps.
getting an LOI, it's like, so this is like when my kids bought a house in the last 5 years. The real estate brokers decided that there's such a so much heat in the market that you got to make an offer today and waive all contingencies and close in 21 days, even without having loan approval, which is insane. Like
Right.
that would have never happened when I bought a practice. And now on the flip side, my kids are selling and they're like, oh yeah, there are going to be contingencies. I mean, the real estate people just decided at one point we don't need it. The next time they do need it, I don't know. It's kind of crazy, but certainly here, what we're seeing is that we're seeing that Michael will spend a lot of time with these doctors trying to figure out, is this the right fit? And I think that's better for our sellers. So when the seller says, who is this buyer? Michael know who's the buyer. The know your client forms you fill out when you're doing lending. It's the same thing here. Get a resume, know who they are, know where they live, know where they want to live. Know what their experience is, know what their financial ability are to do this. Can they manage this type of practice? Do they have the hand speed, as you mentioned? Do they have is it the mix that they'd like to have in the practice? And these are the things the sellers want to know. So when we get on the phone with the sellers, the good question always is, who are these people? And why are you giving them my information? So.
And I think that's important. Like the amount of times that I've seen brokers the buyer makes no sense for this practice, but they allowed the LOI to be signed. They, were in due diligence. And then the question that because I wish I got brought in before the LOI was signed all the time. I don't. But then, I'll ask the question, why are you wanting to buy this practice? Based upon who you are, this doesn't make sense. And so I love the fact that we're doing that, because it's not just a benefit to the buyer. It's a giant benefit to the seller. We're not wasting time. We're focused on who's going to be a good possible replacement for the seller, to continue the operation, to continue into the second or possibly even the third generation. So I love that.
But I want to say that I think the buyer should be reasonable and understand that if they're going to ask for a lot of information about the sellers, it's reasonable to have questions asked about them.
100%.
And but what I find is that they don't always want to share. Like who's your lender, who's your lawyer, who's your CPA. Well,
Wait, they're not giving. They're on the dating apps and they're not giving their real picture.
Yeah. They're
You said you were 6'4".
They're holding back information, but they want to know everything in my client's underwear drawer, right? So, I found myself saying something the other day because we have a high volume practice, and the seller was like, "Well, what kind of questions are you asking?" I'm going through it, and he says, "Well, why don't you ask them for a financial statement, and ask them if they can afford to buy the practice." And my comment was, well, we're gelling primarily with DSOs, so it's never going to happen. And then the people that we're talking to in this transaction are understanding that we have priced this at a level that will knock most of the people out. But I also feel at the same time, if I go back and demand that they give me a financial statement, even before they've not signed a non-disclosure for us to give information, I feel like they're going to bolt. But
for doctor to doctors, that's a great idea, because remember the as you know, the buyers are submitting a personal financial statement to the lenders anyway.
Right.
And typically buyers need 8 to 10% of liquidity
Right.
in order to qualify for a loan. So they've already done this, or they're supposed to be doing it for the bank. So it's not a bad request.
Well, and it happens in real estate too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the point of the conversation. If you're going to lease a house for real estate, you go to a rental app and they ask you all kinds of questions, right? They want to see your financials, they want to see your tax returns, they want to know everything about you, where you lived your last 3 residencies. Right. All that information is provided. You want to buy a house, it's the same. And so I'm asking buyers to be reasonable as well when they come to us. And I think they should understand that the buyers that are reluctant to give us information are reluctant to get information, right? The buyers that come in are willing to give us information. We're willing to communicate information. But like I said earlier, if somebody doesn't, in a prior podcast, if they won't sign our non-disclosure, we're not talking to them.
Right.
But if they sign our non-disclosure, we ask for a resume or a financial statement, and they're not willing to provide that, that's a red flag to our sellers. Because like I said, the sellers are providing everything about their practice. They've really opened up everything to the buyer. The buyer should be just as reasonable in presenting information too.
Yeah, it's like for buyers, when you're talking to brokers, like give us a little information about yourself. So many times I see a buyer inquire, they sign an NDA, then they send me 15 questions, and I might know 7 out of the 15, and I need to reach out to the seller. And when I reach out to the seller, like, well, who is this person? And I hate having to say, I don't know. I don't know much about him. And then you go back and you ask them questions or for a resume, and they just either disappear or they, they don't really give you anything to help their cause, right? So, get to know your broker. Let us get to know you. If the practice doesn't work out, at least, we could be already in communication and help you get in another one. Yeah. And we can explain that to the seller. Like, hey, I've already worked with this guy on 3 practices. It didn't work out. Here's the reasons why, or she. And it tends to flow a little better.
So what are some things that you can give that might make buyers differentiate themselves from other potential buyers? Maybe some good ideas.
Yeah. Pick up the phone. Let's have a phone call. Tell me about yourself, why you want to be in a certain area. Do you have a family? Things that I could relate to the seller. When we talk to sellers, sometimes they're like, oh, I want a young dentist who was like me when I started out. Or I want someone who, is looking to downgrade downsize and move to a different area. But it also then we can text, right? So a lot of these younger buyers say, hey, just text me, tell me what you're looking for. Check in a month if you haven't found something, and I might have something new for you. Mm-hmm. And in that listing process, it could take 2 to 3 weeks to get the practice to market. I can let you know, hey, I found that practice that might work for you, and I'll be willing to get you in the door first. But I won't know that unless we have communication or talk.
Yeah, your point is, do they have a and everything Michael said was true. Do they have a pre-qualification letter? So it's helpful if the buyer comes with a resume, comes with a pre-qual letter, and could be in a position to provide a financial statement rather quickly if it were requested.
But we can help them if they. It's not a negative if they don't have a pre-qual. We can put them in touch with different banks that'll offer that to them as well, right?
Right. Yeah, okay. and we try to do that. I mean, if it's a hot practice and it's going to be on the market for a very short period of time, you better be ready to go. Just like if you're buying a house and you want to get in quickly, you better have everything ready to go. Yeah, if you have your financial statement ready, you have your resume ready, you have a pre-qualification from a bank, and there's 5 buyers trying to get it, you may not have to be the highest offer, but if you're the most ready and you look organized and you have the information ready to go, the seller could look on that very favorably because that's the kind of person they want to buy their practice, somebody that's organized and ready on top of things.
So hot markets versus cold markets in terms of when to bring a CPA in. I typically tell my clients, or when I'm speaking at conventions or whatever, that if it's a hot market, you can't wait 2 or 3 weeks for a CPA to do their analysis, which is one of the reasons why I review things. Now, obviously, I say, look, I'm not a CPA, but we review things on the front end so they have at least some semblance of an idea of the practice, the ad backs, all that other stuff. But getting the offer in quickly, which is why I'm willing to waive that fee, because I want them to have some semblance, even in a hot market, of I've got some representation. I'm not going to make mistakes. I then go on a full stop from an attorney standpoint. And then, because the practice is now off the market, it's pulled off the market, I have exclusivity, Then we send the CPA in. Then we do the chart on it. Then we do all these things. In a colder market, you can wait, especially if the practice has been on the market 6, 9, 12 months. You can wait and have a CPA do an analysis. But do you feel that buyers and sellers, do you feel they understand hot and cold markets and how to play, or do they just view everything the same? Like, hey, a practice in Barstow, I need to treat the same as a practice in Newport Beach.
Yeah, I think people probably treat it the same.
Interesting.
And I think it's buyer specific. So obviously the sellers want to give out as little of information as possible until they're in the letter of intent stage.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll have access to some basic information. But, getting into the computer, looking at schedules, doing some deep analysis on things, that's not going to happen. The CPA review is not going to happen until they're in the LOI and they're in the due diligence phase. But there are certain dentists out there that are quick triggers, and they'll put an offer in instantly and worry about everything later. And then Michael's been working with a young lady recently, and it's probably been 3 weeks in a consultant and 25 emails and 5 telephone calls to get to, yeah, I'm ready to move on phase, So it's really specific. And to your point, that can work for you if you're the buyer, if there's no other people trying to buy it.
Right.
But if there's other people trying to buy it, you'll just miss your opportunity. And Michael, with this particular person, has had to tell this person more than once, too late. Somebody already bought it. They already paid more than you were going to offer. And to the point which Michael has said on a couple occasions, if this deal doesn't get completed, we're not going to deal with this person again because they move too slow. They want too big a discount. They, there's issues there that make it look like they may never be a serious buyer. You might want to expand on what you see.
I mean, just like pre-LOI, if you're going to ask 20, 30 questions, I understand you're trying to figure things out. But at some point, the seller is going to be like, how come they're not making an offer? Right? I'm more willing to share information once we get into that offer stage and when we're doing due diligence. But what Lee was saying, it's not that I don't want to work with them anymore. It's like your guys' time is valuable too. Instead of me but taking all this time to work with you, I could be working with 2, 3 other buyers that are inquiring, at least trying to track them down and get them on the phone or establish communication, right? So
I find it interesting though, in hot markets that someone wouldn't know after the second or third time, I've got to move faster.
Fear.
But not only, but it's also, you're paying someone every single time.
Fear.
Get the offer in. It's like we've talked about for 47 minutes now. It's non-binding. You have the ability to pull out after, but it's yours. Like that's what buyers, you guys need to understand is once you sign an LOI, it's off the market. It's yours if you have exclusivity. Then you start spending the money on due diligence and things like that. And again, that's why if we don't get past the LOI, I just refund the money because I want them to have that on the front end. And so, I don't know.
But it's not taught well in dental schools, practice management. And there's not buyer representation. And there are some really bad brokers out there. And so you add those all things together with a person who's fearful, and it's paralyzing, because they're afraid they're going to get taken advantage of and they're going to make the wrong decision. And they may never be buyers, Jason. We've seen people
100%.
that will never be buyers. But it's always my friend had this happen or my friend had that happen. And so, those other relationships can influence the thinking. But yeah, we're tolerant, we're friendly, we try to get into information. But at some point, Michael's right, it causes sellers fatigue. And more importantly, if it's pre-LOI and there's so many questions, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the term we'll hear is it's a lack of maturity. It's a lack of business maturity on the seller side. And then they're extrapolating that into what they think their experience is going to be post-closing with retreatment issues, uncompleted dentistry issues, accounts receivable issues. This person's asking me 50 questions about signing the LOI. What's going to happen after we complete the transaction? So it doesn't mean they shouldn't do their due diligence. I just think that there should be an understanding that you're going to get enough information to try to figure out if the price is in the ballpark. They're going to get enough information to know if it's, you're going to know if it's the location you like. You're going to know if you feel good in the practice when you see it. There should be enough information for you to make a decision, but then sign the LOI, lock it in, and then go in and do your heavy due diligence and ask all those questions, because that's the appropriate time. That's when it's expected. And even though the sellers don't like it, we've prepped them for that. And and we can also prep them that this is normal. And when they get concerned about post-closing issues, we can come back to it's normal. And I actually say we want a lot of due diligence because we wanted the buyer to do as much due diligence as possible so we don't have any litigation later. So we want them to ask every question they can ask, see everything they can see, and then later if the deal closes and they say, oh, I didn't know this, well, that doesn't happen. In fact, for me, the most fearful thing is to sell a practice to somebody that thinks they know everything. So the person who thinks they know everything comes in, just signs the document, and then the deal closes, and they're complaining later. Well, I didn't know this, I didn't know that, I didn't know this, and I don't care. Right. You had your chance to do your due diligence. What happened? You thought you knew so much, and now you made a bad purchase. I mean, first off, I don't think it's a bad purchase, but your ego was in the way in the due diligence. Your ego's in the way now. So maybe you're screwing up, and maybe it's not the practice. But these people you can't talk to. They know so much. They're so smart. So I would rather have the person who moves methodically, does all their due diligence, asks the right questions. What we're talking about is time and place. So ask enough questions to make a cogent business decision and get into the offer phase, then do heavy due diligence.
Yeah, I wanted to add too, as a broker, I don't have all your answers to your questions. I wish I did, but I don't have a crystal ball to tell me how this practice worked for the last 30 years. My job is to give you what I have and help you get, these answers to your question. But let's be reasonable and figure out what you want to offer, and let me take that offer to the seller and let's see how they respond. And like Lee said, once you get an offer accepted, my job is to get you all the answers to your questions by talking to the seller. And like Lee said, we prep them. They know the questions are coming. I'm here for the seller, but I'm here for you to, make sure you're making that right decision. And I won't say, no, you can't have that answer. I'll do everything I can to get it for you. But sometimes that's easier after you're in the deal more than prior. But, when I show offices, sometimes the seller's not there a lot. So people ask me questions. I'm like, I don't have any answer to that, and I don't want to misrepresent and just say, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. It has 5,000 active patients. Right. So if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. That's perfect. Yeah. And we want to be that broker that's blocking. We don't want to be that broker that's interfering with the buyer getting information. So again, just the time and place thing is really what we're talking about. You're going to get the information. You're just not going to get 100% of it before you make your offer. And it's like a real estate deal. You go out and buy a building, you sign a real estate agreement, purchase and sale agreement with due diligence, and you go do your due diligence, do your phase 1, phase 2, all that stuff happens after the document's signed, not before.
Okay.
So that was a lot to do with LOIs.
That was a lot to do with pre-LOI and the letter of intent. What we are going to be talking about in the next episode is what buyers should be doing with respect to due diligence, the purchase agreement, the lease. If the real estate is involved, how we handle that. So hope you enjoyed. And if you have questions, feel free to click on the link below.